Hello, everyone. I would like to welcome you to the afternoon session of the second day of the quest for democracy in the Middle East and North Africa. Before we begin the session, I would like to take this opportunity to thank Professor Haidem Moghisi and Said Rahnama for having organized such a wonderful conference that is a source of envy at the University of Toronto, where people who come to discuss these type of issues are all foreign affairs and foreign policy related issues rather than the kind of diverse social activists that we have here. So this is great. And the session today, this afternoon, the fourth session, has a lofty title of The Current and Expected Outcome of Political Transitions and Transformation Beyond the Region. The first speaker is Dr. Akbar Zaidi of Columbia University, and he will be talking on what took you so long? Democratization in Pakistan. Let me just say a few things about Dr. Zaidi, who is a distinguished the Pakistani economist. He is currently a visiting professor at Columbia with a joint appointment at the School of International Public Affairs and the Department of Middle Eastern, South Asian, and African Studies. His research is on development, governance, and political economy. He has published extensively, and his 12th book is on military, civil society, and democratization in Pakistan, which was published in 2010. He received his PhD from University of Cambridge. Please join me to welcome Dr. Zaidi.
Thank you very much, Mohammad Tavakoli. I'm very grateful to Professor Haidem Moghisi and Said Rahnama for inviting me. Khayli mamnoonam. It's a great opportunity to be at York University. The session, as Professor Tavakoli said, is about beyond the region. When I read Naguib Mahfouz, who writes about Cairo, and he writes about the Muslim milieu in Cairo, and I think he's writing about Karachi. And yesterday, Mamdouh Habashi spoke a great deal about the military in Egypt and the military economic complex and so on and so forth. I felt he was talking about Pakistan. I'm not sure if Pakistan is beyond the region, and that's something that I want to talk about first before I move on to why we are so late and why you're following us. The MENA region, the Middle East North Africa region, the WHO considers Pakistan to be part of the MENA region. So does Pepsi Cola, and so does Citibank. I'm sure there's something in common there. So in some ways, Pakistan is part of the Middle East North African region. In other contexts, is part of the Middle East as well. You know, Citibank is not, the Maghreb in North Africa is slightly different, but Pakistan is included in the Middle East. The second explanation or reason why Pakistan is not beyond the region, perhaps Bangladesh is, and Imtiaz might be able to talk about that, is that there's an elephant in the room which we've spoken about, and it's not Israel, which has a huge impact in the region. And of course, I think it is very justifiable to criticize the US hegemony and US involvement in the region, and especially in countries like Pakistan and Afghanistan and Iraq. But there is another important player there called Saudi Arabia. Saudi Arabian involvement in Pakistan, which brings Pakistan into the region, is criminal, more than the US, I think. And it's something that Pakistanis are afraid to speak about. I probably couldn't say this. I know I'm being recorded, but I couldn't say this in Pakistan. It's dangerous. It's easy to talk about the Americans and abuse them for everything. And I think there's a justification for that. But I think Saudi Arabia, the role of Saudi Arabia in Pakistan, which brings Pakistan to the region, just not beyond the region. There are 2-3 things. The amount of funding that has gone to madrasas in Pakistan, the Wahhabi Salafist type of, I'm not sure about the difference between Wahhabis and Salafists, so I'll just use Wahhabi. I mean, I'm sure there are scholars here who can tell me what the difference is, but this Wahhabi Salafist sort of madrasaization, the finances that have gone to Pakistan a great deal over the last 30 years, the relationship between the Secret Service of the Saudis and the ISI in Pakistan. It's not something which is very recent. It's been going on for a long time. In fact, the head of the Secret Service in Pakistan frequently goes to Saudi Arabia to ask them whether the military, can conduct a coup in Pakistan. This happened last year. So this is the sort of relationship. And of course, there is something called oil, which Saudi Arabia gives to Pakistan. There's also another small country which is very important to Pakistan, which brings Pakistan to the region, and that is the UAE. The UAE plays an important, not such a significant political role as Saudi Arabia does, but a very important economic role. The third factor which creates Pakistan sort of in some ways belonging to this region is the confusion within Pakistan. Is it a Middle Eastern country or is it a South Asian country? There is a genuine confusion which has been created through the text, through textbooks, through political leaders, through Islam, and so on and so forth. So I think this idea of whether Pakistan is beyond the region or not is still something that is open for discussion. There are a lot of similarities with the Middle East, particularly not North Africa so much, but with what we call the Middle East. Most Pakistanis, 97%, are Muslims. Pakistan has had, for 36 years or more, has had military, despotic, or authoritarian states, very much of the tradition of the Middle East, whether it's Saudi Arabia or Egypt. And of course, there's been US hegemony. I mean, it's not possible to talk about Pakistan and not talk about the US. There's been hegemony, and the US has been a champion of military dictators in Pakistan, as has it's been its tradition in Latin America and all over the world, from the Philippines to the Middle East as well. But there are, of course, differences. The main difference is that Pakistan sometimes belongs to South Asia. Egypt doesn't. So, there is a difference there, and there is that historical continuity, and as I said, it's a problem at times. So there are three or four things that one needs to talk about in the background about belonging to the region. Pakistan had its Arab Spring in 1968, and there was no Facebook. There were not even telephones at that time. It was a genuine revolution without Facebook, Twitter, or whatever else people use, not even in the internet, 1968. And it's very interesting. It's very similar to what's happened in Egypt. And I think Pakistan is closer to Egypt than it is to many of the other countries, and perhaps we can talk about that later. What happened in 1968, that there was a popular revolution. The military was in power. The military was replaced. It handed over to the military. It handed over power to the military. And the military said, we will conduct elections. Elections were held, and a democratic government emerged. The contradictions which had emerged between West and East Pakistan finally came through after 25 years with the secession of Bangladesh. The military had been defeated in 1971. That's very important. I mean, I think there are interesting parallels with the Arab world. The military had been defeated in 1971 by India, and that's why it was possible for democratization to take place at that time. A very important difference between Pakistan in 1970-71 and Egypt and the Middle East, North Africa region is that there were no Islamic parties. There were Islamic parties, but electorally they were redundant. They won a few seats. Islamic parties in Pakistan, political parties, have only won about 8 to 10% of the popular vote. Very important. There was no Al-Akhwan, there was no Nahada, none of that. It was a secular. Secular is not the right word because I'll talk about this a little later. It was something which was packaged as Islamic socialism. It wasn't Islamic, it wasn't socialism. It was a populist sort of sentiment, democratic to the core. So this is 1968, 1970. So maybe Egypt will follow a different path. The 1977 to 2008 is the return of the military in Pakistan. And as Mamdouh said yesterday, the military has not always ruled, as it has not always ruled Egypt. It has manipulated, dominated, manipulated elections and so on and so forth. It has had an imposing influence on the politics of Pakistan from 1977 to 2008. Pakistan's domestic politics has been shaped by what happens in Afghanistan and US support to military dictators in Pakistan. I mean, these two things go together. Whenever there's a Republican president, somebody invades Afghanistan, there happens to be a general in Pakistan and he benefits for 10 years. In 1979, the Soviet Union invaded Afghanistan. Ronald Jimmy Carter was there, he was losing. Ronald Reagan won. Ziaul Haq stayed as president of Pakistan for 11 years. In 2001, 99, when Musharraf took over, the US invaded Afghanistan. There was George Bush, a Republican president in Washington, and there was a military general in Pakistan. Military generals and Republicans. If Obama loses, I think there's going to be another coup in Pakistan, another invasion of Afghanistan. That's been the pattern. So I want to talk a little bit about the last 10 years. The military government of General Musharraf, and then the 2008 people's revolt. Revolution is probably not, is unfortunately not a revolution, but a revolt. General Musharraf, as many of you have known, probably the best known, most recognized Pakistani politician, general but politician after maybe Benazir Bhutto, came to power dismissing a democratically elected government of Nawaz Sharif in 1999. He was disgraced. General Musharraf was disgraced. He was not welcomed by Clinton, by Tony Blair and others. He was marginalized. What saved him was Osama bin Laden. 2001, 9/11 saved him. He tried to change the policy which many have spoken about, the ISI policy in Taliban, of Talibanization, supporting the Taliban in Afghanistan. He played a double game, and I think there's no doubt about that. The Pakistan military has played a double game with the Americans. Nevertheless, Musharraf was a military general. Again, as I said, it's very difficult to use the word secular in the context of Pakistan. So I think a liberal, what we've called a lifestyle liberal. I mean, a military dictator can't be a liberal. He can't be a political liberal. But certainly Musharraf was what we've called a lifestyle liberal. He enjoyed the good things in life, whatever they are. And, he lived well and he had a very good time. But personally, I think he was a liberal. His personal influence on Pakistan in the 10 years that he was in power was fairly significant. He did a number of things. He liberalized the media. I've always had trouble saying that the media in Pakistan is extremely free. I've always had the trouble of having to say that Musharraf was responsible for opening up the media. And I've asked a lot of journalist friends and people in the media whether this is actually true. And they've all said that, well, he didn't stop the media opening up. Maybe it was a moment of the globalization of the media at that time, as it happened all over the world. But in the 1990s, 2000, there was a media explosion in Pakistan. Even when a military dictator was in power in Pakistan, you could go on television and criticize him. That doesn't happen in many countries. It didn't happen under Pinochet. It didn't happen under Marcos. It didn't happen under Reza Shah. But you could do that with a military dictator in power in Pakistan. The media was very free. And I think Musharraf deserves some credit for that. He also did some fascinating things. He used to say that I'm a better Democrat. And this is something that I think Mamdouh raised yesterday, the question of parliamentary democracy or participatory democracy. Musharraf brought about a Praetorian democracy, the military bringing about democracy. He said that you cannot remove me, but you can have democracy at the society level. We can question what he meant by democracy and what we mean by democracy, but I think it's important to examine what Karima said yesterday about opening social spaces. He certainly opened social spaces. He sort of opened non-Islamic public spaces, which, as I said, the word secular is a bit difficult, so non-religious public spaces. He encouraged the participation of women in public life, very actively, as I think people have said today, as Ataturk did, as Reza Shah did. Ataturk was his hero, Musharraf's hero. He could speak Turkish. He lived in Turkey for many years when he was young. So he looked up to Ataturk as a hero, and he opened up public spaces, political spaces for women in Pakistan. 36,000 women were elected in public offices in sort of local government in Pakistan under Musharraf, which is, for a country which is supposed to be conservative, fundamentalist, Taliban, all at the same time, is quite a remarkable development. So I think, one needs to give him credit there. He opened up trade with India, better relations with India. And India has been, Pakistan's, Egypt and Israel sort of relationship. They've had that same animosity for 6.5 decades. But as a military general, and the military has benefited by playing the India card. But Musharraf opened up trade, opened up better relations with India, which is something which he needs to give credit for. However, in 2007, as with every military general, power goes to your head. It starts from the head and it stays there, but it starts to get out of the head. And that's what happened. He dismissed the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court of Pakistan. So a lawyers' movement started, which wanted to not bring about democracy in Pakistan. The lawyers' movement was not about bringing about democracy. It was about reinstating the Chief Justice. It had what are known as unintended consequences. Of course, it became a major motor towards bringing about democracy in Pakistan and dismissing Musharraf. But the original idea was not to bring about democracy. It was to bring about the reinstatement of the Chief Justice. And had Musharraf done that, perhaps Pakistan may not have been a democracy. My story would have been different. So in 2007, 2008, there's a public revolt against Musharraf, largely on account of his using his authoritarianism, taking it too far. So elections are called, the assembly that he had created was finally over. And another turning point in Pakistan's history was the assassination of Benazir Bhutto. In 2008, elections were held in Pakistan. And I can say this, and I'm, now that in my adult life, this is the first time I can say that Pakistan is a democracy. It's a bad democracy, weak democracy, but we can use adjectives later, but it's certainly a democracy. The elections that were held in 2008 were the fairest and freest elections held in Pakistan since 1970. And there were 7 elections in between, which were manipulated by the military, where political opponents were barred and so on and so forth. So 2008 brought about this democratic revolution, but a very peaceful one, which followed the revolt of the lawyers. So that's where Pakistan is now. And it's very different from where the Middle East has been. What sort of democracy is Pakistan? Why has democracy begun? I can't say it's succeeded because it's in process. It's taken 64 years for Pakistan to claim that the government in power today, it may not be there tomorrow, the government in power today is the longest serving democratically elected government in Pakistan. I know there are many of you from the Middle East who are older than me and who can't say that about your own country. But compared to India or compared to Bangladesh, I was talking to Imtiaz earlier, even in Bangladesh, India and Sri Lanka, in the South Asian region from where Pakistan does belong, there are countries which have had 5 years of democratically elected governments since 1951 and 52. That's India. So we are about 60 years behind India, but we are maybe 50 years ahead of some years ahead of the Middle East as well. So it has taken 65 years for Pakistan to have a democratically elected government, which is the longest serving elected government in Pakistan, which is saying something. 4.5 years, and it'll probably be 5. Why has this happened? Why has democracy taken root in Pakistan? I'll finish in 5 minutes. The first is, fortunately, that the military in Pakistan has blundered. It has made serious mistakes. First, it harbored Osama bin Laden. Then it was found caught that it harbored Osama bin Laden. And when the Americans came and took Osama bin Laden, they said that, we had nothing to do with it. So what is the military for if it can't protect its own people or its own sovereignty? The issue of sovereignty came up numerous occasions in Pakistan. Then there was also a couple of other, Talibanization has taken place. Society has become more increasingly Talibanized. Violence has increased a great deal. The Taliban or Al-Qaeda, whatever you want to call them, have infiltrated as individuals, probably not as institutionally, as individuals in military establishment. And there was an attack on a Navy base in Karachi, soon after the Osama bin Laden affair. And you find photographs. The media in Pakistan is extremely free. And I think one of the most vibrant medias anywhere in the world. And I think that's a major distinction. I don't know what the media is like, except for Al Jazeera, but what the media is like in the Middle East. But the media in Pakistan is extremely free. So when the head of the Navy staff came to the base which had been attacked in his brand new BMW, there was public resentment against the army. What kind of military is this? So the military has done a great service to democracy in Pakistan by making fantastic blunders. I think that's a major thing. The second is, there has finally begun a constituency in Pakistan for democracy. the past democratic process in Pakistan has not been something to speak about. Whether it was Benazir or Nawaz Sharif, democracy has been dirty, extremely manipulative, dominated by the military. For once we see that a constituency amongst the rising middle class, the politicians and others, there seems to be a democratic sensibility which is emerging. The third is the media. I think the media, 24/7 live coverage of anything that happens, anything that you whisper, any politician whispers a thought that's on the public. It's not Twitter and Facebook. It's television, which is the main difference, and which is sort of more powerful, I think, than Twitter and Facebook. So a very important contribution. The third one is the judiciary. In the past, the judiciary in Pakistan has always supported military coups, because this is the doctrine of necessity or something like that, that it justifies military rule. Now it's turned around, it's a reborn judiciary which has said that we will not allow the military to take over. But we'll have to wait and see, but at least that's what they're saying at the moment. The final reason why democracy has matured in Pakistan, or is maturing in Pakistan, is that in the past, politicians have invited in the military to come and opposition politicians have invited the military to come and get rid of the government. Now the opposition politicians are saying, we do not want the army to play a role in politics. This is something new that's happened. So there is a turning point in many ways where one can see that the last 4.5 years this transition may have taken place. I keep saying may because it's impossible to make predictions about Pakistan. Nobody would have imagined that Mr. Asif Zardari would have been president of Pakistan. It's not a prediction that even he could have made. So one does not make predictions about Pakistan, but there are hopeful signs that perhaps Pakistan has turned on the road to democratization. I'll finish with 2 minutes. However, Pakistan is not a democratic society. There's something very important. Institutionally, everybody goes and votes. Some people vote twice, but most people vote once. But it's not a democratic society. It's an increasingly polarized, intolerant society. And one reason for that is the excess amount of arms and ammunition which are available in Pakistan. Thanks to the Afghan war, thanks to US money, thanks to the CIA. So when two people fight, they shoot. They don't argue, they shoot. When political parties have differences, they go, it's a street battle that is held. And that's one of the major consequences, whether they're Islamists or whether they're ethnic parties. I mean, this is how disputes are settled. So that's the downside of it. Finally, the biggest difference between Pakistan and the Middle East and Iran is that Pakistan does not have an Islamic political party or Islamic leadership which can seize power. We are very grateful for that. Pakistan has Muslim political parties. It has Islamic political parties, but they are redundant. Most people in Pakistan who are in politics are Muslims. And I think this is an important distinction between Muslims and Islamists. They are not Arab secularists also. Secularism is not a term which is used by political parties. Maybe they are in practice in some ways, very much so, but secularism as a political project does not exist as it does in Tunisia and Egypt, as we've heard. So there is also a problem there. Nevertheless, if there is a Muslim government which is elected, rather than an Islamic political party, I think there's far greater hope for democratization to take place. The last point, what is the biggest anti-democratic factor in Pakistan? That is the military, as perhaps in Egypt. I don't know what its role is going to play in Egypt, in other places. And Saudi Arabia and the United States, which help the military gain power. I'm not sure, and I'm looking forward to the presentations tomorrow. Sometimes I think that Turkey offers some sort of possibility, and I know there are people here who will probably criticize the Turkish model with the AKP in power. But for Pakistan, which has had excessive military involvement, and Pakistan and Turkey perhaps were very similar before 2002 in Turkey, before the AKP came to power. And a lot of people in Pakistan have spoken about the pre-2002 Turkish model. The National Security Council was created in Pakistan by Musharraf, which incorporated the military generals. So there are some lessons to be learned from Turkey, perhaps not, and maybe from Egypt as well. But thank God, alhamdulillah, we do not have an Islamist political party. We have Islamic troublemakers, we have Islamist militants, but they are largely supported by the military. I think the problem in Pakistan is not so much Islam as it is the military and those who support it. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Dr. Akbar Zaidi. Our next speaker is Dr. Imtiaz Ahmed, who is the professor of international relations at the University of Dhaka, and where he was the chair of the Department of International Relations from 2000 to 2003. Professor Ahmed has been the recipient of numerous prestigious awards, and he has published and co-edited over 16 books. His most recent books are Historicizing the 1971 Genocide, State versus Person, which was published in 2009, and Women and Militancy, South Asian Complexities, which was published in 2001. And recently he edited a book on the post-national dictionary and languages. Professor Ahmed has been educated at the University of Dhaka, Carleton in Canada, and also the Australian National University.
Thank you. I have, what, 20 minutes?
20 minutes.
Let me thank Haida, my friend, who got me here. And thanks also to the organizers. Gilbert yesterday was telling me whether I would be using a PowerPoint. And I said, I have neither power nor point. So it's a powerless, pointless presentation. And you have to bear with me. It's a longish paper, though. But I'm not going to read out everything. I'll skip through and try to keep myself within 20 minutes. Well, I start by saying, and there's a good reason why I start with humans. And I said human lives are full of paradoxes. And this is certainly so when the very birthplace of proto-democratic norms remains bereft of democracy and becomes the bastion of authoritarianism. I'm, of course, referring to the Arab world. After all, the first 4 caliphs were all proto-democratically selected, and the organization of civil society, or Jamai Madani, remains an Arab or Islamic contribution to world civilization, lingering on now, however, in the midst of complex post-civil composition of masjid, waqf, that is pious endowment, and madrasa. And I'll come back to all these 3 later on. Put differently, the lack of democratic institutions in the Arab world contributed to the birth of militancy in the name of religion there. In fact, bigotry, colonial rule, and brutal force snubbed the democratic aspirations of the Arabs for centuries. And factors like petrodollars, the fear of Israel, and the US support of the authoritarian regimes further blocked the process towards democracy and democratization of the state and society. In conditions like this, and while being schooled with rigid theological doctrines, many could not help turning towards militancy. Yet, as the poet Rabindranath Tagore pointed out, and let me quote the poet, "I shall not commit the grievous sin of losing faith in humans," unquote. And it is only humans capable of getting spirited when the words of Tagore come to alert him, words that gave Mahatma Gandhi solace throughout his life. And the words were, "If no one heeds to your call, then go alone." And that is precisely what humans did. Indeed, if you take the case of Egypt, with help of the mobilization of talk, of communication, of information, mobile phones, Facebook, Twitter, internet, blogs, television channels, and the like, they came out first one by one, and then in hundreds, and then in millions. And after assembling at the Tahrir or Freedom Square in Cairo for 18 days, they finally succeeded in disciplining Hosni Mubarak and restoring the dignity of the Egyptians. The movement itself was free from known political leadership and without a center, making it no less postmodern or post-archical and personographical in nature. But then what impact did it have outside the Arab world? Indeed, in places which remains related to it theologically, economically, socially, gastronomically, through ideas and dogmas such as Bangladesh. Will the impact be limited to politics, or will it include the religious discourses as well? Will it boost the economy or see a decline? What about the Bangladesh diaspora in the Middle East? Will it play a different role and contribute to the economic and social discourses back home, now that the Arab world is on the way of experiencing greater freedom? Answers, however, may not be as easy as the queries, and there are good reasons for this. Al-Ghazali, the great 11th century Sufi from Khorasan, left the following verses underneath his headrest when he died. And I quote Ghazali, A bird I am, this body was my cage, but I have flown, leaving it as a token, unquote. Similar also is the song of Fakir Lalun Shah, the 19th century Sufi poet of Bengal, although there is no evidence that the latter had read Al-Ghazali during his lifetime. And I quote Lalun, "Nobody can tell me whence the bird unknown comes to the cage and goes out. I would fain put round its feet the fetters of my mind, could I but capture it," unquote. What comes out clearly in both these verses is that a Sufi, like all the mortals, is conscious of being a prisoner in the world of forms. Yet, and this is what makes a Sufi different from the rest of the mortals, she is also conscious of being free, with freedom outweighing his imprisonment. But how did the two verses, originating in two geographical locations, come to reflect almost the same about life and living? Is it because both were Sufis and therefore had internalized reality in an identical manner? Or is it because both were connected psychogeographically, with Lalun reproducing the wisdom of Al-Ghazali despite the distance in time and space? But then how could this have come about? And what relevance does it have when reflecting on the issue of Arab awakening impacting upon Bangladesh today? Here the journey of the Sufis from Kunia, Bukhara, Baghdad, Khorasan, and many other places of the Islamic world into erstwhile Bengal and now Bangladesh as early as 11th century remains no less important in understanding the possible impact of the Arab awakening on Bangladesh in contemporary times. The latter now is not only spiritually, economically, and gastronomically, but also psychogeographically connected to the former. The beginning of all this, however, is worth narrating. So the next section goes on to mainly point out the arrival of Islam in Bengal through the Sufis, in fact. Now, in the beginning, in fact, there was this argument by the Orientalists that the reason why in Bengal suddenly you have so many Muslims. If you look at South Asian map, you have Muslims in the north, which is now Pakistan, and then there's a gap, and then suddenly you have Muslims majority in South Asia on the eastern part. And one argument was given that Islam was forcibly imposed by the Muslim rulers upon the low-class local population. Now, it's easy to see that the argument is very weak. The reason is there were lower caste in other regions of South Asia, in fact, in South India, in Central India. Why that got not, why that, the transformation did not take place, and why particularly in Bengal. There's also the argument of massive migration. Now, those of you who are not familiar with Bengal history, Bengal, the first Muslim rule came in 1203, and it went uninterruptedly till 1765, almost for 562 years, till the British came and took over with the Diwani. But the question, which also I think is, I find the argument to be lacking, mainly because the question still remains, what made the locals accept generously and almost without noticeable violence members practicing a foreign-bred religion? The answer, and this is very important for the democracy that we are talking about in 21st century, the answer probably lies in the tradition of public reasoning in Bengal. In fact, a cue can be taken from Tagore, who summed it up in one of his very popular songs, and I quote Tagore again: "We are all kings in the kingdom of our king. Were it not so, how could we hope in our heart to meet him?" Unquote. This refers to the presence of a precise public reasoning in Bengal that has allowed tolerance and proto-democratic norms to thrive culturally, with state politics and governance remaining largely insulated from this, indeed, as some would argue, on account of colonial imposition of things. The merit of this argument lies in the fact that throughout its age-old civilizational quest, Bengal had invited all kinds of social and religious discourses, including Brahmanism, Buddhism, Vaishnavism, Hinduism, Tantricism, Sufism, and Islam, and allowed even the English to make a permanent presence long before the rest of India did. In Bengal, it started from 1757, rest of India after 100 years in 1857. Amartya Sen too alludes to this when he perceptively points out the tradition of public reasoning is closely related to the roots of democracy across the globe. In fact, when it comes to Bengal, the Sufi saints could easily impress upon the people with their message of love and brotherhood and settle down both near the shore and deep inside the land, not because such messages were new, but rather because Bengal had cultivated a public reasoning of tolerance for centuries. No one knows why this is so, but the vagaries of the weather could certainly have contributed to it. Not so different were the reasons for the relatively tolerant Hanafi mazhab. Now, I'm sure you're familiar in the Sunni discourse, the four school of thoughts, the whole South Asia, or from Turkey onwards to South Asia, till Bengal, is the Hanafi mazhab, largely because of both the Mughals, who were the Chagatai Turks, and also because of the Ottoman Empire being Hanafi. So there's a Hanafi domination in Bengal. Now, among the four prominent Sunni Imams, Abu Hanifa was the only non-Arab, a Persian. Now, born in Kufa, while at the same time indulging in business activities and taking up the profession of providing discourses, Abu Hanifa remained sensitive to the socio-political conditions of his time and place, and was reputed for his flexibility and recourse to reason. Just point out one or two, so give a sense why in the public reasoning this Hanafi discourse is very important, particularly in the present Bangladesh that we talk about, and why there is a lack of militancy or Islamist, as has been argued in last 2 days. One day Abu Hanifa said to his disciple Abu Yusuf, who was writing down what he was saying, and this is what Abu Hanifa said: "Woe to you, Yaqub, do not write down all that you hear from me. I may have an opinion today and then leave it tomorrow. I may have an opinion tomorrow and leave it the following day," unquote. This only shows that Abu Hanifa was ready to update his views in the light of new evidence and changed circumstances. Now, one can go, there's a series of examples of how the use of reason by Abu Hanifa and how that contributed to a kind of a more tolerant version. Now, the reason why I'm saying all these is mainly to give a sense how that crept into the soil of Bengal. Now, one important thing which, let me see my time, whether I should go, okay, I have 10 minutes. This is one particular contestation. This is where the secularism discourse in Islam should be, can reflect to Islam. And this relates to Abu Hanifa refusing to become the chief Qadi in the court of Al-Mansur. Now, what did it signify? There are various accounts of the disagreement between Abu Hanifa and Al-Mansur, but the one given by Al-Rabi ibn Yunus, the wazir of Al-Mansur, stands out. And let me just read out a little bit from that particular dialogue. I saw the Amir al-Mu'minin clash with Abu Hanifa over the Qadiship. Abu Hanifa said, "Fear Allah and do not give your trust except to the one who fears Allah. By Allah, I am safe from favoritism, but how can I be safe from anger? If you threaten to drown me in favoritism, unless I accept the appointment, I would prefer to be drowned. You have courtiers who need those who honor them for your sake. I am not fit for that." Al-Mansur said to him, "You lie, you are fit." Abu Hanifa retorted, and I quote, "I have declared myself unfit, so how can it be lawful for you to appoint someone who is a liar as Qadi?" Unquote. So you can see this discourses one after another, which would tell you that when Islam came to Bengal, it had a public reasoning of greater tolerance. Now, on the second section, which I refer to a particular issue on the civil society, the Jamai Madani, and take three particular areas. One is the masjid, which has a proto-democratic norms, the endowment, and madrasa. But what happened during the colonial period, all got distorted. Whether it's the masjid, it did not remain the assembly that used to be historically. The waqf, the endowment also became distorted, and not to mention madrasa, which had a flexibility of having both the rational sciences and the theological sciences, the makulat and the mankulat, also got distorted, particularly when the British, when they established the Aliyah Madrasa under Warren Hastings, mainly to promote what you call the understanding of Islamic laws so that the British could rule. Now, taken from there, I come to the third section, which talks about, because of this colonial legacy, you have a kind of a distorted civil society altogether. And something that Akbar pointed out is very polarized, very violent, and one can go empirically actually look into these factors. The third section talks about globalization and Wahhabization and Bangladesh. Now, the two factors very quickly which contributed to it, one is the rise of petrodollars, and the second one is the Bangladeshi diaspora. Never in the history of South Asia, we never had so many South Asians or Bangladeshis living in the what is known as the Hanbali heartland. And that created a contestation of what is authenticity in Islam. So the authenticity of Islam that used to be in Bengal, and Bengal used to take pride because of the Sufi and the Hanafi discourse, that got displaced by this, what we call an hegemonic element. Now, if you look at even to the Mughal period, there were proto-democratic relationship between all the mazhabs, in fact. If one had problems and very strict, the other madhab would say, no, go and resolve your problems by going to that jurist. Don't come to me. My school is more strict. So they had this relationship, but that all got vanished after the colonial era, and etc. Now, let me conclude, in fact, because I have only 5 minutes. And this is going, if you are familiar with, very quickly, if you remember, Deleuze and Guattari said something of re-territorialization when you deterritorialize. If you deterritorialize, you also re-territorialize. And this is where I want to reflect in the conclusion. Will the awakening make a difference? And let me read out the last section. The awakening, the Arab awakening, does not promise a perfectly just society, nor was it ever meant to be during the unfolding of the campaign, whether in Tunis or Tahrir Square. And this goes very much with what Amartya Sen had said when referring to the importance of preventing manifest injustice. And let me quote Amartya on this. When people agitated for the abolition of slavery, in the 18th and 19th centuries, they were not laboring under the illusion that the abolition of slavery would make the world perfectly just. It was their claim, rather, that a society with slavery was totally unjust. It was the diagnosis of an intolerable injustice in slavery that made abolition an overwhelming priority, and this did not require the search for a consensus on what a perfectly just society would look like, unquote. Indeed, similar is the case with agitation against Ben Ali, Mubarak, Gaddafi, and the like in the Arab world, justified not on the ground that the removal would bring democracy to the Arab world overnight, but that the authoritarian or undemocratic regimes that they had nurtured and institutionalized are no longer acceptable. In this light, and with respect to Bangladesh, the Arab awakening opens up the possibility of contributing not only to the consolidation of democracy, but also to the promotion of diversity and religious tolerance. But then, as lessons from history indicate, the challenges can be overwhelming. Creative intervention would be required at least in 4 key areas. And I will end by reflecting on these 4 key areas. The first one is political. Gandhi once said that those who try to separate religion from politics understands neither religion nor politics. Put differently, if tolerance, justice, and morality are ingrained in religion, then politics too ought to be ingrained with tolerance, justice, and morality. Any shortcomings of the latter in politics would force the population to seek solace in religion, not always with peaceful outcome. Marx, I believe, highlighted this dialectic the best. And let me quote Marx. Religious suffering is at one and the same time the expression of real suffering and a protest against real suffering. Religion is the sigh of the oppressed creature, the heart of a heartless world, and the soul of soulless conditions. It is the opium of the people, unquote. In this quest, a cue can be taken from Abu Hanifa's contestation with Al-Mansur. The state must not only remain just vis-a-vis the person must also be provided with a space to dissent and protest if the state becomes unjust. This empowering of the person then ought to be the goal of politics. This is the big challenge because until now the goal has been to empower the party, the community, the nation, and the state, often in the name of nationalism or majoritarianism, secular as well as religious. Arab Spring is otherwise a reminder of the right of the person to protest against the excesses of the state for nurturing intolerance, injustice, and immorality. Indeed, with reference to politics and more specifically governance in Bangladesh and elsewhere, this would require not only structures ensuring grassroots participation of the people and plurality of religious and secular discourses, but also, for instance, democratization within and outside political parties so that the latter would refrain from turning into something authoritarian. Secondly, civil. The manner in which Jamai Madani or civil society as product of Islamic civilization got distorted over the years, particularly during the colonial and post-colonial eras, remains a hurdle in creating space for emancipatory discourses and building consent amongst the diverse forces of the population. Recovering and empowering the civil society otherwise is as much a secular task as it is Islamic. In fact, since the demise of the Mughals, and the advent of the colonial power, certain structures became entrenched and limited the power of civil society, mainly for reproducing the power of the state. The post-colonial regimes, benefiting from an overdeveloped state, to use Hamza Alawi's term, and a truncated banal civil society, made no effort to limit the power of the state. And there is no guarantee that the state would be interested to do anything different. It is here that the Arab awakening becomes a potent force for not only challenging the power of the state, but also strengthening the historical and jurisdictional claims of civil society. There is no denying the fact that the current state of technology, from the mobilization of talk to the Googleization of knowledge, has contributed to the task of empowering the person and ensuring the creative role of civil society. And it is this space of civil society that needs to be ensured, expanded, and utilized not only for containing the power of the state, but also for transforming the state. Thirdly, economic. Critics often refer to the fact that three economic factors gave rise to the Wahhabization of Islam in Bangladesh. One, the rise of petrodollars and the use of the wealth to spread the doctrine. Two, the formidable growth of Bangladeshi diaspora in the Middle East and the remittances from the latter becoming key in reproducing the economy. And three, Bangladesh's dependence on fossil fuel civilization, that is the purchase of oil from the Arab world on favorable terms. If this is the case, then a justified expectation would be that a replacement of Wahhabism with democracy and democratization in Saudi Arabia, for instance, would radically transform the state of political economy in Bangladesh. In this context, Arab awakening holds a promise far more profound than the removal of authoritarian leaders and the holding of elections. The challenge, however, lies in the fact as to what extent the change in the political domain would bring change in the economic domain. Gramsci did point out, though, that, and I quote Gramsci here, everything is political, even philosophy or philosophies, and the only philosophy is history in action, that is life itself, unquote. But then there is no guarantee that the impact, particularly in the economy, would be linear and overnight. In view of the complexity of one domain impacting upon the other, it is important to reinvent development, since economic deprivation did play a role in the Arab awakening, and there is no ready-made model to overcome such deprivation, whatever the rhetoric of post-Ben Ali, post-Mubarak economic prosperity may have been. Finally, intellectual. In recent, and I'll end with this para. In recent time, the intellectual content that made an impact in Bangladesh could be best referred to as fundamentalism. The latter, however, differed qualitatively from the pre-colonial interactions of Bangladesh with the Arab world and the knowledge dissemination arising out of it. Generally, fundamentalism is understood as a modern reaction to Western dominance based on a dogmatic interpretation of the Holy Scriptures. But this, I believe, is very much commonsensical and a misplaced notion. Fundamentalism is nothing but a linear or singular interpretation of things, and it could be religious as well as secular. Ku Klux Klan, Osama bin Laden, or Saudism would be worthy representatives of the former, while Hitler, Stalin, and Pol Pot would remain at the forefront in making up the latter. I could include Yahya Khan on this also. The authenticity of Islam, nurtured by the Sufis, which Bengal used to take pride in, got displaced, as indicated earlier, with colonial modernity and the hegemonic claims of the Wahhabis or Saudism. The challenge lies not only in confronting the latter intellectually, but also in creating space for an intellectual intervention in favor of plural, critical discourses. An intellectual intervention of this kind is required not only nationally, but also post-nationally, creatively reproducing interactions with the Arab world and reaping benefits from the Arab awakening. After all, we are in the same boat, physically as well as psychogeographically. And there lies the merit of this conference as well. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Professor Imtiaz Ahmed. Now we will have about 15 minutes of break, and then we reassemble for the second part of the session. Thank you. We have two speakers in the second part. The first is Professor Sergei Plekhanov, who will be speaking on Russia and the Arab awakening. Professor Plekhanov is Associate Professor of Political Science at the York University, and he's also the coordinator of the Post-Communist Studies program. And before coming to Canada in 1993, he was the deputy director of the Institute for the Study of US and Canada, and also is a member of the Soviet Academy of Sciences. Professor Plekhanov.
Thank you very much. Yes, I was not planning to present a paper at this conference, but questions about Russia and Russia's attitudes, Russia's policies at this new stage of the history of the Middle East are cropping up all the time. I've given a few television interviews where people were asking me, why is Russia behaving the way it is? Why is it supporting the Assad regime? Why is it balking at strengthening international sanctions? Why is it supporting Iran, and so on and so forth? And the interesting thing is that it's not only television, it's people all over, including some participants in this conference, including my own son. The other day he called me, following reports of another massacre in Syria. What is Russia doing? And it's interesting that people are asking that question, because from some point of view, you would just shrug it off and say that's normal behavior. Why are we asking the question? Because in the 20th century, Russia was a very important player in the context of a major upheaval in the Middle East, another Arab awakening, because in the 20th century, Russia was associating itself in a consistent manner, more or less consistent manner, with the world revolutionary process. It was a major challenger to the global capitalist system, and as such, it had important ideological and geopolitical interests involved in the anti-colonial, anti-imperialist struggles in the Middle East. The one big dilemma that the Soviet Union was faced with at that time was to reconcile its support for the communist parties in the Middle East with the national democratic Arab socialist regimes which were cropping up. As you know, the conflicts between those two types of politics, but the important thing was that, yes, Russia was associated with those rising forces, revolutionary forces. Russia was seen as a revolutionary power. So, and that has its legacy. I mean, the memory of those days carries on. On my visit to Egypt a few years ago, I was confronted with a question from a couple of prominent politicians in Egypt about Russia's disappearance from the Middle East. Where is Russia now that we need it? In a different way, not as a country promoting revolution, but as a country helping rebalance the unbalanced power equations in the region. Well, time has changed, and today, post-Soviet Russia is a capitalist country, and it has a form of capitalism which is characterized, can be characterized as oligarchic, bureaucratic. It has a semi-authoritarian political regime. In many ways, it resembles the regimes that exist in the Middle East, such as in Egypt. Oh, the differences are huge, but the similarities that strike the observer. Russia, even though it has come a long way since the catastrophic condition in which it was in the first decade of its transition from a Soviet system to some form of capitalism, and it has experienced a resurgence. It's now viewed as one of a group of rising powers or resurgent powers. But it's still very unstable, very fragile as a state, and its economy is also too dependent on the exports of hydrocarbons and not enough modernized to withstand the rigors of international competition. So today's Russia is conservative-minded. The thing that really strikes about the Russian mindset today, and that refers both to elites and to large segments of the public, is a conservative mindset, fatigue from big upheavals and changes. Even though, and I will refer to that at the end of my presentation, that is changing. So a conservative phase, which existed in Russia for at least a decade and a half, is giving way to something else. So if we are used to talking about the Arab awakening, it's now time to talk about the Russian awakening, which began not in the spring, but in the winter. On the other hand, the Arab awakening also began in December. So in December of 2011, a new phase in Russian politics was inaugurated. Yes, I'm talking about the Russian awakening. That's December 2011. It started with the parliamentary election in Russia. So the Russian elites today are in a very different place from where the Soviet elites were 30 years ago. The Russian elites today are part and parcel of the global capitalist elite. And in many ways, they share common interests and concerns with Western elites. But on the other hand, there are competitive interests, and there is competition for influence, for power, for access to markets, and things like that. And in that competition, one point of particular concern for the Russians is the hegemony of the United States in world affairs. So unipolar world, the behavior of the United States is the hegemonic power, which sets the terms, which intervenes when it sees fit, which creates narratives which then shape the behavior of other states. This is a point of major concern for the Russians. While Russian-American relations today are better than at any time one can think of, at least from the beginning of the 20th century, the fact remains that there is a competitive aspect to that relationship. So if Russia is opposed to US hegemony, and if it is concerned about the United States playing too great a role in world affairs, then it follows from this that Russia would be and is pursuing counter-hegemonic policies, looking for partners to balance out the United States. Just in the past few days, we saw visits of President Putin to Paris and Berlin. This triad or trilateral partnership, by the way, has not disappeared since the historic moment when the three powers combined to try and prevent the American intervention in Iraq. It has now disappeared. There have been dozens and dozens of meetings between the heads of the three states, and they discuss matters with the Americans being absent, and they have a different discourse there than the ones that they have in G8. It's just one of many examples of the way the Russians play this traditional balance of power politics. It's an ancient way of conducting your diplomacy. So there's nothing particularly inventive about it. It's traditional and pragmatic pursuit of your national interest. The national interest today is the magic word that the Russian elite, the Russian foreign policy makers use when they describe the goals of the United States. Pursuit of national interest, which they interpret primarily through business and security. It is the national interest of post-Soviet Russia to be safe, secure, and to have access to all international markets, and not to be endangered by any powerful coalition of other states who might be hostile to it. This is how Russia positions itself in its new post-Soviet incarnation. How does that apply to the Middle East? In the Middle East today, Russia's influence as a state is limited. Gone is the ideological connection between the Soviet Union and the revolutionary forces in the Middle East of various kinds. the influence, including economic influence, has drastically declined, and it has, as has Russia's influence all over the world. It's a smaller player in world affairs than the Soviet Union was when it was still in existence. There is no long-term strategy that Russia would have in the Middle East. There's no long-term vision. I would say that there's no clear purpose in Russia's policies in the Middle East. And there are no deep interests, no profound commitments. In fact, if you were to generalize about Russia's behavior in the Middle East, one thing comes to mind, that Russia seeks not to create enemies in the Middle East and seeks to be friends. And in each case, friendship has to have some economic background, some kind of a business benefit for Russia. Friends for everyone. So one of the biggest changes that has occurred since the Soviet days is that Russia now has a friendly and quite strong relationship with Israel, not just with the traditional allies in the Arab world. And by the way, the arguments for normalization of relations with Israel, which were advanced even when Gorbachev was in power, had to do in particular with the need for Russia to have a more balanced position in the Middle East. How can you act as a mediator in the Arab-Israeli dispute if you only have relations with the Arabs and no relations with Israel? So there was a pragmatic foreign policy argument to be made for normalization of relations with Israel. But capitalist Russia and Israel have enormous ties as two capitalist states which have a lot of business to do together. At the same time, Russia plays a mediating role, or tries to play a mediating role as part of the international arrangement with regard to the Palestinian issue. So it seeks to maintain its relationships with the Palestinian forces and to try to be helpful in resolving the problem. Another new thing, as far as Russia's positioning in the Middle East is concerned, that today's Russia seeks to be accepted, in particular in the Organization of Islamic States, Organization of Islamic Conference, as a Muslim state. Because up to 20% of the population of Russia is at least culturally associated with Islam. And a percentage of that community are actually devout believers. And the revival of Islam in Russia is one of the many remarkable changes that have occurred since the collapse of the Soviet Union. So Russia is pragmatic, opportunistic, short-term vision, looking after its own business interests. This is the Russia that was confronted in December of 2010 with the start of a new revolutionary process in the Middle East. The Arab Spring caught Russia by surprise. It was like a deer in the headlights on a highway. Suddenly there is this new thing happening and it doesn't know how to react. And the first reaction, kind of gut reaction of Russian elites to this development was a sense of danger. Not celebration. I mean, in the old days, any kind of revolutionary upheaval like that would be welcomed in Moscow in official pronouncements. Yes, that's the continuation of a revolution. Here, there is danger, sense of danger. Oh my goodness, things are falling apart. What is the context of that fear? First of all, before the Arab awakening began, there have been a number of anti-authoritarian rebellions, peaceful rebellions in the post-Soviet space. In Georgia, in Ukraine, then in Kyrgyzstan, the so-called colored revolutions, which were liberal democratic in its ideology, which were supported by the West and which were seen by the Russians as threats to the hard established stability in the post-Soviet space. So fear of chaos in the post-Soviet space is a very, very important concern for the Russians. So when they look at the Arab Spring, they immediately begin thinking about regions within Russia, about neighbors of Russia in Central Asia, and they think of the bad example that the revolutionaries in the Middle East can give various groups in the post-Soviet space. And as is increasingly obvious now, in Russia itself. One of the elements of that fear is the observation that the revolutions in the Middle East, the recent revolutionary upheavals, the awakening, is usually led by urban middle classes, the intellectuals, Western-oriented people who have basically a liberal democratic agenda, anti-authoritarian spear of these movements. But then the real force that then comes to the center stage are the Islamists. And fear of politicization and radicalization of Muslims in Central Asia, in the Caucasus, and within Russia itself. Russia itself, the Russian Federation includes 7 republics, which are culturally designated as Muslim. And Chechnya being the most extreme example because it fought a war of independence, which, by the way, ended on terms which ceded Chechnya remarkably broad sovereignty, both in cultural matters, because in Chechnya, Sharia law is recognized on a par with the state law of the Russian Federation, and also economically, Chechnya, as an example of sovereignty, is the fact that it has its own customs. You can imagine how important that is for Chechen elites to play all kinds of market games in the world economy. So the second element of fear had to do with the fear that Russia may lose the remaining partners in the Middle East. Gaddafi, Assad, the Iranian regime. If this broad sweep of democratic anti-authoritarian change continues, then Russia might actually lose the remaining assets in the region. And then third element is the association of the West with the support of these revolutions by the West. We know that it's a more complex picture than outright Western support. And especially after Libya, the readiness or the willingness to become militarily involved in overthrowing a regime. That created a mindset or a concern in Russia that this is actually, the Arab awakening is part of the global offensive of the West. And this is a new form of interventionism. And it's ultimately aimed at reducing further the power and influence of Russia and endangering stability in the post-Soviet space. Libya became a turning point. As you know, both Russia and China voted on a crucial resolution at the United Nations Security Council in 1973, voted to abstain, virtually opening the gates to NATO intervention in Libya. And the fact that that the resolution was implemented the way it was created a powerful backlash in Moscow. So Syria was chosen as a place where Russia would prove that it will not allow another transgression like the one that NATO did with regard to Libya. So at this point, the Russians have not yet developed any kind of a sensible strategy. 5 minutes, yes. Sensible strategy vis-a-vis the increasingly dynamic events in the Middle East. Its posture, which we are observing on Syria as a case in point, is not a winning strategy. It's kind of a holding action. It's a rearguard action where you are putting forward proposals which cannot be carried out because they are not inapplicable. They're not applicable to the political situation on the ground. It's a passive policy. It's a reactive policy. And given the background which I mentioned, it's not surprising. This is what you can expect from Russia in its current incarnation. It follows from the entire mindset and the nature of the interests of the Russian elites, the Russian ruling classes, and so on and so forth. For instance, is it possible to imagine that Russia would come to the military aid itself, getting militarily involved on the side of the Assad regime? I think it's unthinkable. So even though the Russians seem to be standing up by the Assad regime, at the same time, they are happily involved, or maybe not so happily involved, in multilateral efforts to negotiate some kind of a compromise and prevent a full-scale civil war. And we are seeing that the Annan plan was a big input from Russia into the Annan plan, and the Russians were very happy with the fact that that plan got going. So the Americans and the Russians, for all their skirmishes on the Security Council, they actually were happy to cooperate in putting forward the Annan plan. Now that that plan is in trouble, they are talking about the Yemen plan, creating conditions under which Assad and some leading members of his elite would be allowed to exit the country and into a safe place. I don't think it will be Russia, but who knows? But at any rate, and opening the way to a political resolution between the rulers and the opposition forces. The Russians are not willing to challenge the West on this. They are willing to stake out their position and to bargain. So bargaining, trying to act as a mediator, winning points, making trade-offs with the United States and with European leaders in one way or another, without a clear sense of a long-term purpose of all this bargaining. This is what characterized Russia's behavior today. So can we, I mean, lots of criticism that Russia gets today, and can we say that this is a retrograde, conservative, backward position, and so on and so forth, as opposed to a progressive position that is being taken by the United States and its Western allies, which is on the side of the people against a corrupt authoritarian regime, which is killing the people by the thousands, and so on and so forth? Well, this dominant Western discourse on Syria and other places is, I think, that we know that's partially, it reflects only part of what's really going on. So there's a validity to the Russian concern that the West has gotten into a mode of intervening in civil wars in the Middle East. Because, number one, the consequences of this kind of intervention are not taken into account. I mean, consequences for the people. If an intervention opens up a country for a massive inflow of Western capital, Western influence, especially when oil resources are concerned, how much does this have to do? It's enough to look at the catastrophic consequences of the invasion of Iraq under false pretense. And by the way, Russia was opposed, as I mentioned, together with France and Germany. So this conservative posture, opposition to interventionism, seeking to resolve conflicts by political means, and in particular focusing on state strength. One of the dominant concern for the Russian rulers is strength of the state, and that includes strength of the Russian state or the Ukrainian state, other states, Middle Eastern states. This concern about the states crumbling under the impact of the onslaught of globalization, I think that's a concern which is not limited to conservative elites in Russia. So finally, we should also mention the fact that the conservative phase in Russia is over. Russia itself is now in this new stage where demands for democratic change, the rising politicization of the civil society, and the rather successful challenges that the civil society is posing to President Putin and his elites are opening up all kinds of possibilities. It could result in a major destabilization of Russia. It could result in a revolution. It's not impossible. Very much depends on the ability and the wisdom of the current rulers in Russia and Putin in the first place, whether they will be prepared to accept the need for democratic changes, whether or not they would be able to find common language with the opposition and avoid further polarization and radicalization of protest. But at any rate, it's obvious that Russia is going to move toward greater democracy and greater social justice. So some kind of a social democratic evolution is in the cards for Russia, at least if we look at the better scenarios, not the worst case scenarios. And then the question will arise. Is the current association of democratization with opening up to the globalizing forces and association of state sovereignty with authoritarianism, is that stranglehold there to stay? Or are we going to see the rise of states which would be governed by democratic-minded, socialist-minded elites, which at the same time would be standing up for the independence and sovereignty of their states and the ability of their states to conduct policies which would reflect the interests of the peoples of those countries as opposed to interests of transnational capital. This is a central issue for Russia, and this is a central issue for the Arab awakening as well. So maybe at some point in the future, the awakened Russia and the awakened Arab countries will rediscover each other in a new form of a partnership and alliances which would fight for common goals and win some victories. Thank you.
With that, Said, please.
My question is to Dr. Zaidani. Of course, I have a question to all, but I want to limit my talk. I mean, I enjoyed listening to the very optimistic picture that you gave of Pakistan, and I hope this is the case. But I have my doubts because I had a sense that you are limiting yourself to Punjab, maybe Sindh, and no mention of Balochistan, northwestern frontiers, tribal areas, which ironically they discovered how to have a stateless society way before Somalia and other places. So there is this danger, and there is this policy going around that particularly in relation to Balochistan, the West may have a strategy of shooting two birds with one bullet or whatever. And that means that separating Balochistan, creating a grander Balochistan, making smaller Iran and a smaller Pakistan to create the problem. So this, what do you think of this?
Actually, not at all. I think you're wrong on both counts. The tribal areas in FATA, this is what democracy has done. Pakistan is a terrible democracy. Let's start with that assumption. It's not a model which other countries...
You said it's very good.
It's improving. It's a very weak democracy. It's not like Bangladesh. It's not like India. It's not even like the sort of troubled democracy in Sri Lanka, which has its own problems. It's probably a better democracy than what Egypt has been under Mubarak. So, relatively, and it's getting better. I'll tell you how. And you've identified two problems which democratically elected governments have been able to address. Not resolve, but address. FATA, this area on the tribal areas, they decided to give them voting rights, first of all, which didn't happen in the past. They decided to, the government, with the elected government, not the military government, the elected government decided to give them more representation in the politics of Pakistan. FATA is a difficult area, the tribal area is a difficult area because of the war on terror. That has complicated everything in Pakistan, whether it's the military, whether it's Islamists, whether it's the Taliban, Al-Qaeda, and democracy. It's just screwed up everything. If you didn't have the war on terror, the things would be different, but you have the war on terror. Nevertheless, the democratic government has tried to deal with these issues. Balochistan also, just last week, the parliament in Pakistan has had extensive discussions. The opposition has been very actively involved to give the Balochi people more rights, to disband military cantonments, for example, and to give them further provincial autonomy. There are plans by the Americans, I mean, which one hears about that something was passed in the US Senate by some senator that Balochistan should separate. But there is resentment against the central control, but under a democratic dispensation, a weak democratic dispensation even, I think there is more possibility to negotiate and to give way. Under an authoritarian military government, which has created much of these problems, things have been different. So even the military was involved, the present military was involved in these discussions over Balochistan, and they have also decided to disband in cantonments and allow more provincial rights. So I think, I keep saying that Pakistan's democracy is a weak but getting better democracy. And we see that over time. It's extremely corrupt, inefficient. It's not a model for other countries, but it's improving compared to what it's been in the past.
Thank you. Dr. Zia, you are thinking really hard. hard there. Would you like to contribute to the discussion?
Just two quick comments, actually. That,
the mic.
The mic is all right. It's fine. It's true that the two problems.
Could you pass the mic? Don't.
Thank you. No, I think that the other problem, if you get deeper into the discussion on Pakistan provincial differences, a little known fact is also that the frontier province and Balochistan are two what we call, Dr. Zaidi is right, that we hesitate from using the word secular, but by and large these are two provinces that have remained immune from Islamist influence in terms of their governance until in the frontier province under General Musharraf, when the Islamist alliance with the deal brokered with the General Musharraf came into power. And when they decimated the frontier province, there was a situation when the members of parliament could not go back to their own constituencies precisely because of the failure of these religious parties to deliver any form of governance and the kind of militancy that had taken over in the frontier province. Balochistan has always been compelled by or moved or governed by a kind of a secular approach to its governance. So I think that the internal politics of these two provinces has held much more promise for us, and the fact that they resist the center all the time. Despite the distribution of wealth is unequal and there's resentment in these provinces, I think their own internal dynamics has more hope for us. We sort of look at them as the resistance to Punjab hegemony in Pakistan. And that is continuing and reformulating itself in many ways.
But my question is, why you say that it is a very bad democracy? Why do you have to name it democracy? After all, democracy cannot be possibly reduced to electoral participation. Because by that definition, Iran is also a democracy, but bad democracy. So, for example, I really want to ask, forget about the rights of women, because that's very clear. That, since the Hudud ordinance, that remnants of it is still available. What about the rights of minorities, for example?
Let me remove the word by bad and replace the word weak. It's a democracy which is evolving, a country which has had 40 years of military government, which has had elected governments, not democratic governments in the past, which has had elected governments, which have had the military breathing down their necks and deciding who's going to replace whom. That's been the pattern in the past. So after 2008, you find a group of seasoned politicians who have been betrayed by the military, who've learned a lot and who've come back, and they've made one thing clear: they don't want the military back. That's the first thing. That's why it's a democracy which is learning and improving. The question of women and of minorities is a burden from the Ziaul Haq Hudud Ordinance, the Islamization of the military in the past. And I think Afia said this yesterday in response to somebody, that once Islamism is imposed in any country, whether it's Iran or whether it's Egypt, it's going to be extremely difficult to undo that. Now, the minorities, the religious minorities in Pakistan, even when they are, as I said, there's excessive violence. Even when they are killed in their mosques and their places of worship, there is very little protest from either civil society or from political actors. It is one of those troubled, unresolved problems which exist. I mean, women, minorities, and of course, poor people as well. I mean, it is a very neoliberal economic order as well. So there are those elements as well. So one has to, I would defend the fact that the democratization process in Pakistan is recent, if the elections are held, as one hopes, in the next 6 to 8 months, and a new electoral parliament is elected, one hopes, again, as Said is right, maybe it's optimistic, but perhaps it's based on the recent experience, and that one is moving away from the past. And I'll just end with one point. I think the critical point has been the killing of Osama bin Laden. I think whether it was the Americans who came in and the sovereignty issue, whatever, his death has changed the nature of the war on terror, at least in Pakistan. the number of suicide attacks which used to take place has diminished a great deal. Al-Qaeda and the Tehreek-e-Taliban Pakistan have been broken because Osama represented sort of a myth in some ways and an ideologue in others, but his killing has broken the movement. It still exists in pockets. So I see that as a turning point, and perhaps there's some way forward.
Thank you. Yesterday, and I understand earlier this morning, there was intense discussion about the range of Islamic movement, whether you have moderate, radical, and conservative Islamic movements. This can be turned to a more general question of in the Middle East and North Africa and South Asia. Can we talk about weak and strong democratic states and whether there are a range of states? Any member of this panel would like to say anything on that?
Well, in the case of Bangladesh and also Pakistan, I think the point that Haida made is valid, that it is electoral democracy and nothing more than that. Because all these political parties within doesn't have any democracy. It's either a family or a particular leader, in fact. And he or she is very authoritarian. And that's it, in fact. Now, whether we call it democracy or not, that definitely is a question. And I always refer to Bangladesh democracy as electoral democracy. That helps actually in trying to push democracy agenda further, in fact, either in democratizing the civil society or democratizing the political party. Now, Akbar, I believe you'll also agree that even in Pakistan, whether it's PPP or Nawaz Sharif, within there is hardly any democracy. And unless you have a democracy within, it's very difficult to have a democracy without. And that's the position there.
It's an incomplete process. I think you're right that because it's incomplete, it allows for further rule.
Any other contribution to this discussion?
I have a question.
Yes, please. Dr. Ahmed.
Yes. This question goes to Professor Plekhanov. Yeah, I'm asking about the internal dispute, if exists, between Russian ruling power and the Middle East policy. Whether there is any factions who oppose whatever Putin administration has said as the Russian policy on the Middle East. The second question is about Iran. Don't they think that they are damaging themselves by siding with the existing government? Because during the demonstrations in 2009, when the Russian recognized the elections, the result of the election, people in demonstration openly opposed this, and they chanted the death to Russia, if you remember that. Don't they consider this facts that they're losing long-term interest in the Middle East?
Thank you. Excellent questions. And on the first one, yes, there are divisions. There are differences of opinion in Russia with regard to how to handle the revolutionary upheavals in the Middle East. And when Russia voted to abstain on Resolution 1973 on Libya, President Medvedev was in the Kremlin. Mr. Putin was the prime minister. And in fact, the Russian ambassador to Libya resigned in protest and fired off a highly critical paper. Actually published his own cable that he had sent to Moscow, explaining what a disastrous act that was, because the West will just take over and Russia would be squeezed out. Russia's interests would be compromised, damaged badly, and this is a short-sighted policy in the face of the relentless drive of the West to take over. And now that Mr. Putin is in the Kremlin, who represents a more conservative, a more nationalist approach, more skeptical of working together with the West than Mr. Medvedev represented, you see the hardening of the Russian attitude. Now, in fact, it's a risky game what the Russians are now playing, and Syria and Iran are two very different situations, and the nature of the Russian involvement with Syria and with Iran is quite, I mean, the two cases have to be seen apart from each other, even though they are to some degree connected. But the point is that the risk for Russia is that it will damage its relations with the West, which remain a priority for the Russian rulers, and it will damage its image in the eyes of the Arab public, or indeed the public in the Middle East. And that would be, from the point of view of Russia's stature in the Middle East and Russia's willingness to become a bigger player in the Middle East, it is the worst of all worlds, because you're neither with the rising forces, because you're doing everything to kind of minimize the importance of these changes. You show openly that you are fearful of this rising wave of protest, and at the same time, by opposing Western intervention, you are creating new points of difference with the West. However, I would like to emphasize that we should not view this posture as entirely reactionary, ill-advised, benighted, and so on and so forth, because we should not glorify RTP. Responsibility to protect. Liberal interventionism is a tool of struggle for international power and influence. And the validity of concern about state sovereignty and state capacity is rising by the day. So it is a tragedy that every time you have a democratic revolution, or in many cases, you see collapse of the state. You see collapse of the state, and then that gives revolution a bad name. We shouldn't be surprised that Mr. Shafiq might actually be elected the ex-president of Egypt, because the Egyptians are tired of the chaos and of the tremendous damage to the economy, the tourism industry, and so on and so forth. By the way, when the Russians decided to elect Putin for the third term, they were thinking along the same lines. As the Russian awakening began, at first they thought, hey, we can get rid of Putin. And when they thought, okay, we get rid of Putin, what do we get? And when they looked at the options and the possible aftermath of the overthrow of the Putin regime, you saw the wavering middle, the great silent majority of the Russians, reluctantly shifting to the devil that they know.
Yes. I understand completely what you have mentioned about the history, and that you called also the old assets of the Soviet Union and so on. And when I try to understand an attitude, I put myself into the other position and try to think its way, the same way, and to find out what is better from my point of view. That means him. And as I have mentioned, as an example, how in the very beginning the Muslim Brotherhood were principally against the upheaval before it started, during the period of mobilization. But despite that, the upheaval came, and on the fourth day, that means Friday, 28th January, they decided, as you mentioned, pragmatically, not of principles, pragmatically, this is the horse which is going to make the race, to jump over. So, and from this logic, I cannot understand the Russian policy, because if I were in their position, I would mobilize these old assets. I would see a little bit, few years forward, and consider the situation. I mean, I can describe this not from the perspective of the old Soviet Union political elite, but as a capitalist state, and with all concerns you have mentioned. I think putting their weight on the wrong side is not in their favor. Therefore, I cannot understand it. And if I have to describe it as a policy, I would say it's stupid. It's very short term. Yes. Sorry.
I quite agree with you. In fact, Sabit may recall that we discussed this question a few years ago. We agreed that there's no policy, and that's the point of my presentation.
Short term.
Yeah, well, it's a if it's a sum of reactions to elements of pain here, pain there, threat here, fear there. And the long-term strategy is not there. You see, again, comparing it with Soviet times, there was this fundamental belief that the Soviet Union is committed to the world transformation. And even though you had increasingly conservative elites in the Kremlin, they still continued to believe in that, and they would periodically put it in their programmatic statements that the rising struggle of peoples against imperialism and so on. So you support a revolution, you feel that you're on the winning side of history. If you support a revolution in Egypt today, and if you're Russia, you might actually be supporting something that will pose tremendous damage. Russia today increasingly perceives itself as a status quo conservative power, with one exception, that it would like to reform the world as a multipolar place, where states are strong and as sovereign as possible. So it's not entirely wedded to the status quo, but then it is focused on the strength of the state. And that's why when they see another state collapsing, that's why Libya was so painful. Forget about Gaddafi, it's just about another state collapsing. And they've experienced in the post-Soviet space a number of very, very painful aftermaths of collapsed state. Russia itself today has not yet recovered from the collapse of the Soviet state.
It's almost a pre-Soviet.
You're right. In fact, ideologically, pre-Soviet statecraft, the statecraft of the Russian emperors, has now experienced a kind of a revival where people are citing the wonderful examples of late 19th century. Putin himself, by the way, now that he's in power again, is comparing himself or citing as a beautiful example the figure of Stolypin, who was the prime minister of Russia in the midst of the Russian Revolution. Now, he was determined to stamp out the revolution of 1905, while at the same time promoting radical reforms. So give us, he was saying, give us a generation of peace. You will not recognize Russia. It will become the strongest state in the world, the most developed, advanced state in the world. But revolution is like a disease which must be fought in a radical way. So Putin is now citing still, well, that's exactly what we need at this point. You change, but the state remains strong, and we, people who are running the state, benefit from it. We are secure in our position. You're right.
This would explain also their policy in the Shanghai group, this financial
Shanghai Cooperation Organization.
Yes, this financial new formation.
It's not financial, but it's a regional grouping. By the way, if you look at the components, right, of the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, which was launched by Russia and China, it's with 4 Central Asian states. Now, all those states are authoritarian. So, and all of those states feel threatened by the possibility of massive popular uprising, democratic attempts at democratization of various kinds, and so on and so forth. And they also feel threatened by politicization of Islam and the use of Islam as a vehicle for future revolutions. That's why, by the way, Muslim Brotherhood, the victory of Muslim Brotherhood in the Egyptian elections, if it's Mr. Morsi as opposed to Mr. Shafiq, that's decidedly bad news for Russia, because Muslim Brotherhood is on record favoring Islamic revolutions in Russia and the former Soviet Union. They've steadfastly supported Islamist uprisings, the growth of politicized Islam in Russia. They've actually maintained links and so on and so forth. So it's like you elect Morsi and then Egypt becomes a hostile state from the point of view of this aspect of relations.
Thank you.
Just a question again to Professor Plekhanov. I had this assumption that Medvedev was the guy of Putin, but you are telling us that he actually is like less conservative and has a different views than Putin?
Yes, the Russian elite is not monolithic. In fact, there are several factions there, and they compete, and they have different priorities, and they have different policy perspectives. When Putin stepped down after his second term, and Medvedev was elected on the recommendation and support of Putin. Of course, it didn't mean that Putin exited the scene. As prime minister, he retained more power than Medvedev. And yet, there was a recognition that you have a liberal wing of the Russian double eagle, or liberal head, and a conservative head. Conservative head, bigger and heavier in terms of influence. In Russia, they were saying we have two presidents, one senior president, and that's Prime Minister Putin, and the junior president, which is the current president, Medvedev. Okay. Now, they traded places again, and Medvedev is the prime minister. But in the discussions and the debates that followed in Moscow over the issue of Libya, Putin was prepared to defer to the advice and the preferences of the more Western-oriented and more liberal-minded groups in the elite, especially because the president constitutionally is responsible for foreign and security policy.
Now, can I ask one more question? I really am learning a lot. That's why I don't want to take advantage of your being here. Can you tell us a little bit more about the opposition to Putin? I mean, what kind of political orientation they have?
Okay. First of all, there's opposition to Putin within the ruling elite. And they were disappointed. The Russian awakening was triggered off by Mr. Putin's decision to run for the third term, which was something that the more liberal groups in the ruling class did not like. They wanted the second presidency of Medvedev and gradual, cautious liberalization, okay? So when Putin announced that he was running and that he would most likely be elected, you had the start of a very, very interesting political upheaval in Russia, which then spilled out into the streets. Nobody expected that. The fascinating thing about the Russian awakening was that it was driven not by elite decisions or strategies, was driven by the pent-up reservoir of opposition and demand for democracy that spilled into the streets. It was uncoordinated, network-based, spontaneous citizen action.
It's very much like Arab Spring.
Exactly, that's why and by the way, it was inspired to some degree. The Russians were avidly watching. The media was covering Egypt. In fact, most Russians were, of course, rooting with people who were fighting in Tahrir Square. There was very little love lost for the Russian street for the likes of Mubarak. So you might say that, yeah, it's the Egyptian disease to some degree, right? Contagion. Oh, well, shouldn't we be surprised? Remember when in the state of Wisconsin, there was this protracted struggle of labor rights. Egyptian revolutionaries were sending donations to help. And the Wisconsinites were proudly saying, hey, thank you very much, our brothers. So Occupy movement was also inspired. So we have this new form of intifada, if you want, against all kinds of authoritarian politics. Now, you're asking about the main streams, main formations. There are three types of forces in this Russian intifada, Russian awakening. There are the left-wingers, and they are communists and social democrats. The Russian communists are more like social democrats today. They are for reform of the Russian system, not for the total replace. At some point, yes, they are in favor of replacing it with full-fledged socialism, but they have a different form of socialism in mind than the one that collapsed in 1991. Then there are the liberals, bourgeois liberals, you may call them, or liberal Democrats. They are anti-authoritarian. They're very pro-Western. And all they care about is that Russia has rule of law, fair elections, that the police is reined in, that the KGB Inc. is put in its place and doesn't play such an important role in the Russian state as today. And the third group is nationalists, the Russian nationalists, because Russia today is 80% ethnic Russian, and those Russians feel that they're underrepresented and that they don't have the real power in the Russian state. There is mobilization against immigration. Anti-immigration politics is an important factor of the Russian political turmoil. So if you try to create a government composed of these three disparate elements, it's not going to be able to govern. And the most fascinating thing was that these people were marching in the same columns, and that in the parliament, the parties representing these three streams were working together. And they continued to offer all kinds of opposition to the Putin government. So for now, the demand for democracy and fair election and accountable government have created a common front from these three very disparate elements. The weight of each faction, the socialists are the biggest ones, socialist and communist, the left. The left currently represents between 30 and 35% of society. The nationalists, 12 to 15%. The liberals, 10 to 12%. This is roughly, the rest are pro-government majority, which is actually a relative majority because it's less than 50%.
60-some years ago, after the independence of India, and in the heat of the events of those times, a group of leaders decided to change paths, and basically they formed a country called Pakistan, which I think by its name they made a statement, the land of the cleans versus those who left behind. Don't you think that the events of those days and these statements that I just referred to are haunting the society that is identifying themselves with a religion?
I think that at some point you leave the past behind, and there is a debate, which academic debate, a political debate, whether Pakistan was created as a Muslim state or an Islamic state. A very big difference, and I said that also when I was speaking, that one needs to differentiate between the two. A state for Muslims or a state which is to be governed by Sharia or Islamic norms. I don't think there was any understanding at that time and for many years that and even now, that it's going to be an Islamic Sharia-based state. Very few people in Pakistan want a Saudi Arabian or an Iranian type of country. If they look at a country which they want to model themselves on, it might be Turkey or Malaysia. Both because they are economically successful as well. Although Malaysia is an Islamic state in its constitution, but other than that, it doesn't look like Saudi Arabia. So I think that this differentiation. The problem with Islam in Pakistan, and it has been that the military, it's called the Mullah Military Alliance. How the military has used Islam to further its own ends, whether it is staying on in power, whether it is creating havoc in Kashmir in India, or Chechnya. The Pakistani ISI has been involved in Chechnya, in Georgia, in Sudan, everywhere else in the world where there has been some so-called Muslim resistance. It's a political movement rather than a social movement. Although conservatively, Islam is prominent in Pakistan, 97% are Muslims, but it's not a political Islam on the basis of, say, Iran or Egypt or Saudi Arabia even. So, I think that Pakistanis would prefer to be Muslims and have democratic state systems, political parties, and not become a Sharia-based Islamic state. So, and I think that was the origin as well. There have been moments where it's gone way off track, but perhaps you're moving back to the origins.
Thank you much. One last question. Yes.
One small point about Russia again. I don't think Russian policy toward Middle East is stupid. And also, it has a policy. Even not having a policy itself is a policy. But they have a policy. I think Sergei eloquently explained the series of concerns that Russians have in relation to Middle East. There is no chance, there is no way that Russians would go and seek their own traditional allies, which are the communist parties, Communist Party of Syria would hate the present regime in Russia and vice versa, the favors are returned. So there is no way that they could go good. If they are going to join, they will lose. And if they lose, what happens? Syria is the last basis that Russians have in the region. The only naval port that they can access to in the region is in Syria now. And And also, they know that by losing Syria, Iran will be weakened. And in that case, Americans will gain their own aim, you know, which is going to be the supreme, continue to be the sole superpower there. And I think that is why they are worried. I agree that Russia will never get into confrontation with the West. Even at the height of Soviet Union, Arabs knew that if there is a major confrontation, they cannot count on Russia, on Soviet Union. But at least they will try to drag it on, as you rightly said, you know, to make as much pressure as possible to make some gain in order to have a better deal in relation to Syria. And they may succeed.
Can I add? Yes, please. No, I also think that
hey, 1 second. You need the mic. Yes, but I just make one note. Just not to give our guest a wrong idea. The communist parties in the Arab world still look at Russia as a very with a lot of sympathy. At Putin. Putin is seen as, you know, an anti-imperialist. That's how he's seen by the Communist Party in the Arab world.
Sorry. Yeah, just to add to this, first of all, one of the chief factions of the divided communist movement in Syria is completely part and parcel of the Assad regime also. So if they maintain links with Russia through, you know, their old acquaintances, this is, you know, something that I'm sure affects Russian policymakers. Plus, there's another thing, Sergei. Perhaps the Russians really believe that Assad could win, that they are on the winning side, that the winning horse might not be the revolution, that they think he could pull it off. And, you know, more and more, you know, I'm not saying that they're absolutely right, but there is a chance that, in fact, this regime, unlike, you know, the others in Syria or in Egypt or Tunisia or whatever, has a minority group supporting the Assad, but it is so completely bound up in terms of its own physical survival with even the personality of Assad that they are willing to fight to the very end, and that they might actually win this.
If I may comment on that, first of all, absence of policy or presence of policy, now you see it, now you don't. That's what happens when a state acts pragmatically, without setting out a strategic vision, without particularly caring about the long-term consequences. You act today based on the realities of today. You ask, how is that affecting our interests? And in a volatile situation, that might actually work better than a vision-based strategic line, which could be disastrous. In fact, as I mentioned, the traditional power politics, this is what animates Russian rulers. When you just make alliances wherever you can. You try to build good relations with the Palestinians, including the Hamas, and at the same time with Israel, and with the United States, and with Syria, and with Egypt. By the way, adaptation to the regime change in the wake of Arab revolutions has been quite quick. So the Russians, you know, very pragmatically accept the new status quo. And for example, the representative of the Syrian opposition have made a number of important visits to Moscow. And they've been involved in all this hard bargaining. So when the Russians talk with the Westerners about ways of settling the Syrian conflict, they also refer to things that they've discussed with Syrian opposition. Because they would like to be on good terms with Syrian opposition, just as they were establishing links with the opposition in Benghazi when the Libyan civil war was raging. So they're not stupid, but they're just short-sighted and pragmatic, cynical, and so on. But above all, they feel threatened by this raw energy of popular uprising. This is the main thing, because it cuts very deeply, and they immediately project it onto their own situation. If you want to have political change, let that be orderly, based on the Constitution, evolution versus revolution. As they like to say in Russia, we've had more than enough revolutions in the 20th century. We need a break. But they're not going to get it.
Gentlemen,
I appreciate your talk. It was really informative. My question is in regards to Saudi Arabia, because you briefly touched upon that in the beginning of your presentation, and you said that they had a role in Pakistan that was perhaps greater than the US's role. So I'd just like you to expand on this and whether you believe that Saudi Arabia is acting autonomously or with Western influence. Thanks.
When the first Soviet invasion, Afghan invasion took place by the Soviet Union, Saudi Arabia became a player in the region, in the Pakistan region and Afghanistan, and a large amount funded the Mujahideen, just as much as the CIA and Ronald Reagan did independently. So it became a parallel track. In Pakistan, it's easy, convenient, popular to criticize the United States. And we see that every day, and it's valid. It's impossible to criticize the Saudi regime because they are Muslim brothers, because Makkah and Medina are there, because they are good Muslims helping Pakistan. That's what a lot of people believe, so it becomes very difficult. But the involvement of the Saudi Secret Service, the involvement of Saudi money supporting madrasas, the involvement in Saudi money in sectarianism in Pakistan. I mean, the Iranian government is also involved in supporting the Shia minority. But it's, the Wahhabis are supporting, the Saudi Wahhabis are supporting the Sunni sections of the Sunnis as well. So it's a sort of a large amount of money, probably money, I'm not sure about arms anymore, but sort of dividing and playing their own game. I think Iran, there's also a sort of a turf war against Iran in Pakistan. But it's also linked to this war on terror. It's not, had the 79 invasion not taken place of the Soviet Union, Pakistan and that region would have been very different. But, that would have been a different story.
Yeah. Could I add a comment as far as the timing of the intervention, the Pakistani involvement in the Afghan situation predates the Soviet intervention. It started almost immediately following the Saudi Revolution of April 1978. And the United States as well, as now has been documented, began supplying arms to the Mujahideen in the summer of 1979, a full 6 months before the Soviet Union invaded. And in fact, as is also clear, there was a design. The Americans were interested not simply in helping the Mujahideen, but making sure that the Russians know that the Americans are in. And that became the decisive factor for the decision for the Soviets to get involved.
Okay. Now, I just wanted to add specifically, the Saudi Arabia intervention, more recent examples would be, it's not just that they intervene at a micro level as well. For example, they fund boys' madrasas, but not girls' schools, which is just as well, perhaps, but that's one example. The other thing they do is in the Raymond Davis case that took place recently, the CIA agent who killed 2 Pakistanis in Pakistan, the diyat money was organized and brokered by Saudi Arabia. Now Saudi Arabia had nothing to do with this internal issue, but they did that. And the third example is when the lawyers' movement for the restoration of the Chief Justice was taking place, in that too, and this was resisted, in Saudi Arabia was involved in that. They sent their ambassador to Pakistan, and this was resisted strongly as an interventionist, as a specific intervention, and a very blatant one by Saudi Arabia. So these are some of the very recent specific examples, apart from the larger ideological, territorial, games that are played. So there are very specific ones you can point out. The other quick point that I wanted to come back to was what Heidi was asking, and I think Professor Madani mentioned this as well, about the indicators of democracy, including what could be indicators of a weak democracy. He mentioned 2 of these, and I'll just mention quickly 3 with reference to Pakistan. One is that you'll see one of the indicators that there are local community actors who are jostling for political power, which we did not see under dictatorships or under different regimes. And these are young pretenders who are vying for leadership. They are challenging the old alliances. So that's one indicator. The other one that Professor Imtiaz also mentioned is ethnic groups are demanding more voice in the process. And in South Asia, we always do it violently. Unfortunately, it plays itself out violently, as in Sudan as well, but they are still demanding a voice in the process. So, you can define that as an an unpleasant feature of democracy, but it's still, I think, a democratic jostling. And the third one, when you asked about women, is that if you look at what I call Musharraf's women, because they were opportunistic enough to jump into his party because he opened up and the reservation seats. They jumped into his party and they served, under his puppet government. But as soon as he went into exile after he was removed, they opportunistically jumped to back to the mainstream parties, political parties. They didn't give up the kind of investment they had made in the political process. And Professor Zaidi is right that because Musharraf raised the bar for liberal initiatives in the, what we are, I don't think outside this room, he or I would talk about Musharraf as a Democrat or as raising, but he raised the expectations of liberal democratic interventions. So now there's a competition amongst these parties to meet that bar, to raise the level and to meet and to be politically relevant. You have to do better than what he did. So these, I think, are some of the indicators of that flawed, weak democratic process that we were talking about.
Thank you. I entirely agree with the necessity I'm the last one who would dispute the necessity to criticize the Saudi kingdom. But I think you are bending the stick too far in the other direction in presenting the Saudi kingdom as an independent factor in all that. The Saudi kingdom works very closely with the United States. And if it funds the Mujahideen, it is because the United States cannot fund them officially through official channels. In the same way they funded the Nicaraguan Contra, and there's no Muslims there, So, you have to see the Saudi kingdom really as a major asset in the strategic system controlled by the United States. And the fact is, this being said, that the Saudi kingdom rests on two pillars. One is the monarchy, and the second is the Wahhabi institution. Now, the Wahhabi institution have its autonomous kind of intervention, madrasas and the rest, which are not, of course, guided by Washington. And that's the relative autonomy here. But it is marginal compared to the role of the state and, of course, the high funding, because the Wahhabi institution doesn't fund in billions, whereas the state funds in billions. So I think this is important to keep in mind.
That's a fair point, yeah.
Professor Mohammad.
Yes, just one comment regarding what Professor Plekhanov calls the Russian pragmatism, that I totally agree with you. But at the same time, perhaps it's pragmatism / opportunism. And that's not something new, actually. Throughout the history, they have been that way. And during for example, vis-a-vis Iran in particular, because even during the time of the national oil nationalization, Mossadegh, they absolutely refused to take sides and waited until the very last minutes, basically, when perhaps the opportunity had been lost for the nationalists and the left. And they have continued along that way. And because of that, except for the pro-Soviet to the party, the other left groups have always these resentments towards the Russians. And the liberals and the ordinary people even more in that way. And right now, what Kazem mentioned in terms of, the position that they have vis-a-vis the Iranian government is even causing further damage to the image of Russians in Iran. After the 2009 election, when there were demonstrations and people were somehow forced or intimidated to take part in the demonstrations, when the loudspeaker actually chanted death to America, death to Israel, the crowd responded death to China, death to Russia. So, this is really this opportunism that maybe opportunism and pragmatism actually go together in every context.
I agree with you that there is continuity. I would also mention that a huge country with more neighbors than any other country, all the way from East Asia and the Bering Straits to the Scandinavia, has to be pragmatic and opportunistic. I mean, this is a lesson that was learned by the Russian revolutionaries from the first days of the Soviet government, from 1917. They found out how damaging the single-minded pursuit of ideology can be to the interests of the state. And so, you know, and Stalin was notoriously opportunistic and pragmatic. Problem is, and the big difference is that still in Soviet days, there was this long-term ideological commitment to a world which would be transformed along some kind of a socialist model. And that is totally absent from the orientation of today's Russian leaders. They see a system which is already there, and they are trying to find for themselves the best possible place in that system. It's adaptation and integration rather than systemic challenge.
Just one quick question. You seemed, I mean, if I understood you correctly, you are saying that there's no militant Islamist movement in Bangladesh. You're giving historical reasons for that and all that. So who are then behind those people who, for example, jeopardize the life of someone like Nasrin, Taslima Nasrin? What is the network? Who are doing that?
Now, what I was getting into is there is this Wahhabization element now, and it has crept into and has actually distorted the earlier Sufi, Hanafi kind of tolerance that is there. So what you have is a creeping Wahhabization. And anti-Nasrin could be even from secular forces, in fact. So even with this particular government, which is pro-secular, also feels allergic to, Taslima, that Taslima has gone beyond, what would be the normal way of, discoursing with Islam. So this creeping in Wahhabization is something that is a problem, but it has it has fared well vis-a-vis Pakistan, if I want to use that example, or even Indian Muslims relatively, is because the cultural context that is very much Sufi and very much Hanafi. It's very difficult to break that, in fact. The only problem that we are facing now is you have the remittances coming from the heartland of Wahhabi. So you have that push. So you have a bottom-up kind of, the migrant workers trying to say, no, what you see in Makkah and Medina, that is the authentic Islam. And so you have a blackization of veil and a lot of other things coming from there. But also you have a top-down petrodollars with the NGO, Islamic Bank funding and all. So you have a bottom-up and a top-down. But it has sustained, so far it has kept well, largely because you have a historically very, a cultural context, and which is very difficult so far. It's proving very difficult to break. Now, but there is no guarantee, because unless you innovate or be creative, and unless you have an intellectual intervention, even vis-a-vis the Salafi or Wahhabi, or the tolerance that you're talking about, people have forgotten a lot of interesting things. And I was just, the gentleman is not here, the very idea of having a social contract. And he was saying that we hear Hobbes, Locke, and Rousseau, but not Ibn Khaldun. And we don't get that idea that there is a past which really talked about all these. So there is also a decline of Islamic scholarship. Now, in the decline of Islamic scholarship, the secularists have not done well in countering what is coming from the Middle East in terms of Salafi discourse or whatever. So you really need an intellectual intervention to overcome. But definitely there has been an element of Wahhabization which has crept into all the various layers, whether you call it secular, religious, everybody got infected. And I don't think you can hold it for long unless you have a serious intellectual intervention there.
Thank you. Please join me to thank the member of the panel for their stimulating presentation and